Good morning. Good to see everyone this morning. We'll have to be sure afterwards to congratulate Kyle, not on the excellent song service. You're welcome to do that of your own accord. But this was his first time putting together the song slides for his own song service. And, I haven't known Kyle as long as some of you have, but I've known him long enough to know that, and I said this before, that while that's one small step for man, it's one giant leap for Kyle Kind. So that's great. So before we get started, besides that, wanted to point out that we're getting all the more close to lectureship. I know we've been announcing that, but sometimes it's good to hear the same thing from different places. Lectureship is coming, and it's going to be coming fairly soon. Be sure that if you have the opportunity at all to do this, that you've taken the opportunity to maybe take a little bit of time off work if it's needed. I would love to see all of us who are here at the leadership seminar. I think that's going to be really good. That goes on Thursday and Friday. But at the very least, lectureship starts Friday night and then runs through that weekend. There isn't a better way to spend a weekend than the Alaska statewide lectureship. And the great benefit of this particular Alaska statewide lectureship is that I'm not speaking. So you're going to hear other speakers, and so I just really think that's going to be edifying and uplifting for us all. And so plan on being there April 19th through 21st, and there's various other ways you can help out if you have the ability to do that. Let's get started this morning and talk about faith in our desire. Faith in our desire as we think about Hebrews 11:13 through 16. One of my least favorite subjects in school was science. And yet, one of the concepts that stood out to me is osmosis. Osmosis is where basically you can have something that will kind of migrate through a membrane from an area of less concentration to an area of greater concentration and kind of balance the two sides out. And some people, I'm convinced, as relates to osmosis, they think that's going to happen as it relates to the way the Bible will work in their lives. Like, maybe if I just put a Bible close enough to me, that the process of osmosis will see that this inexhaustible source of wisdom and knowledge will somehow come into my life. One of the memories I had growing up in the South, I've never been a big fan of country music, but there was this song which unfortunately was about alcohol, but I didn't think it was. It was the chorus said there might be a little dust on the bottle, but one of those things that grows sweeter with time. And I remember thinking as a kid that they were saying there might be a little dust on the Bible, which made it such a good song, because it is one of those things that grows sweeter with time. But the problem is that actually it's not true. If there is any dust on the Bible, it will never grow sweet to you. You'll never realize that his words are sweeter than the honey in the honeycomb if you never actually spend any time opening up and considering what it says, right? So we need to actually consider the Bible to be absorbed by it and not to put it near us and hope that it absorbs into us somehow. And the same thing can be said of Christian friends. We sometimes can have this attitude that if we surround ourselves with the right kind of people, then that will filter into our lives. And there is a bit of truth to that. If evil companions corrupt good morals, then it stands to reason that good companions will assist in good morals. But at the same time, it just won't be the case that simply surrounding myself with a loving church family, availing myself of Christian friendships, is going to have the immediate or obvious outcome that I'm going to be able to get to heaven. Because heaven can't be reached without a burning desire that is realized only in thoughts, attitudes, and actions. What I mean by that is that you'll only have a burning desire if heaven dominates your thoughts, attitudes, and actions. As we can see the patriarchs exhibiting in this little sort of aside in the text that we're studying. So as Wayne pointed out, we have been thinking about people like Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham. And in the midst of these statements about these great people of faith of the Old Testament, the author pauses to actually think about their desire and get us to think about their desire. What was in their hearts? Well, what was in their hearts was actually a series of kind of paradoxical ideas. Paradox is not two doctors. It's like two things that don't seem to go together, right? And so what are the things that didn't go together in their minds that really ought to be in our minds, not going together as well? Well, the first thing was that they understood the idea of being fulfilled in unfulfillment. Being fulfilled in unfulfillment. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13 says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, they were assured of them, and they embraced them." See how they didn't receive the promises. In fact, when you think about Abel, Enoch, Noah, and Abraham, and certainly the people that are going to follow in this text, they actually received very little of what it was that God had promised them. You could argue that maybe Noah received the most because he was told, build a boat and you'll be saved. He built a boat and he was saved. And yet at the same time, the hope that was running through the people of that time, the hope that one day sin wouldn't be such a problem and there would be a seed of woman that was going to triumph over the serpent, Noah didn't see that promise being fulfilled. And in fact, the serpent ends up triumphing over him after he gets off of that ark, isn't it? He got drunk and there's some kind of lewdness that his family commits with him. And the whole picture is kind of tainted of this man who was godly and who was living by faith. It's the story over and over again, though, of these people. Even, there are stories of them messing up like that they lived in faith, but they didn't receive the ultimate thing that they were hoping for or looking for. And some of them, again, didn't receive very much at all. We talked about Abraham last time and how Abraham, he gave up his country and his family and his house in the hopes of being made into a great nation. And all he got at the end of his life was one child, one son. Enoch, the preacher of righteousness, who was banging his head against the wall, trying to get people to pay attention and focus on the message that he was giving, to turn them and their hearts back to God. He didn't see any of that in his lifetime. And in fact, the world, as we've mentioned in the time of Noah, got worse and worse. Abel, he hears what he needs to do to worship God. He worships God and he gets killed for his trouble. These are people who were looking for something more, and they didn't receive it, but they embraced what they had been promised. We're going to make a couple of references to something by way of illustration that some of you might have heard of. Stanford University conducted a series of experiments they call the marshmallow experiments. A lot of you shaking your heads maybe you've heard the story, and so bear with me for those who haven't heard it. But the marshmallow experiments were experiments in delayed gratification. And what they wanted to discover was not only the effect of delayed gratification given certain variables, but they made it a longitudinal study, the effect of delayed gratification in childhood, how that would bear out in later years. And one of the things they discovered as relates to the later years, follow-up studies showed that the preschool children who delayed gratification longer, they were described by those who were influential in their lives as being significantly more competent than their peers. There was just a sense that if they got that as a child, that they were just already so far ahead of the curve that kind of bared out in their life, as well as that the ability to delay gratification correlated with higher SAT scores. And obviously, Stanford University, they're considering worldly metrics and all of these kind of things, and yet there was this value that was realized of delayed gratification. So the question for me is, as I think about unfulfillment, being fulfilled in unfulfillment, how good am I at delaying gratification? How good at I am waiting to get what I want and being satisfied with what I have? Godliness with contentment is in of itself what? Great gain. Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6. I'll give you three things to think about. There's so many things that we could think about as relates to this point. But how good am I at delaying gratification in my prayerful desires? Is one thing that came to mind. James chapter 4, if you'll open your Bibles there, James chapter 4, beginning in verse number 1. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? We so often find that our difficulties are created by the things that we desire or crave, especially if our cravings aren't governed by God. It's said that we can, obtain possessions, but so often it is that possessions possess the people who possess them, if you can follow that sentence. that it really is that people get so caught up in what they want to obtain that they are willing to fight and destroy what they have in order to get that, be it material things or be it certain situations. And so James asks really the question, how is that working out for you? He says, you lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, and yet you do not have because you do not ask. You never thought about the greater being that's in your life that you're supposed to be going to for your desires. And yet he says, you ask him even and do not receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures. To be governed by what we desire, to be dictated by what we want to have, is to be a person who is, as verse 4 says, committing spiritual adultery against our God. Adulterers and adulteresses. How are they that? Because they've tried to make their friends the friends of the world, the friend of wealth, the friend of evil companions, the friend of prominence. He says, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God, that it creates an enemy of God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And all of this is being said to those who are Christians. It says that we have to be careful about what we really, really want. What we really, really want needs to be shaped by God. And as relates to the things of this world, we need to be satisfied with whatever it is that God has given us in that moment. As Paul says, he learned contentment in the times when he was brought low and in the times that he was exalted. We have to be satisfied with whatever God has given us in the moment. We have to be satisfied with the place that God has given us in our relationships, the position of a servant, position of one who is subservient to the needs of others, all kinds of things that we can think about as relates to our prayerful desires. What about when I am mistreated? Am I fulfilled in unfulfillment? We so often crave satisfaction, justice. We crave, things to be what they ought to be, and sadly, they're not always that way. Well, what do we do when they're not the way that we want them to be? In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the harsh, for this is commendable. If because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully, endures. And still, in the context of enduring, not just avoiding or ignoring, but instead being submissive to these masters who are mistreating them. He says, for what credit is it if you are beaten for your own faults and you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. I know none of us, and thank God for this, understand the perspective that he's describing in this text, the perspective of being a slave and having a master. We don't get that. We don't know what that's like. And yet you will find, and I've certainly found this, that situations will play out in your life, sometimes the same situation over and over again, and you will find yourself being mistreated, and you will find yourself powerless to really do anything about that. And what do you do when that happens? Well, instead of taking that as an opportunity to get back, to get even, instead of taking that as an opportunity to avoid, ignore any of those kinds of things, to be submissive, to serve. For, as verse 21 says, to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. Yes, Jesus left all kinds of examples for us, but the one that this text is talking about is the ability to endure and to look towards a greater possibility. Because Jesus served those who were killing him, he enabled them to have the hope of heaven. And if I take the opportunity of being mistreated as an opportunity to get even, to do wrong, then I've damaged both souls, and that opportunity for salvation is out of the picture and ruined. So am I fulfilled in the unfulfillment of being mistreated? Number 3, am I fulfilled in giving to the Lord? I love the picture of giving in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1, the picture of the Macedonians and how they looked beyond their needs and their circumstances, one, in following the teaching of Jesus to the needs of others, and two, in looking in confidence to God to care for the needs of their present rather than feeling like they had to do that for themselves. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1, Paul says, moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the Macedonians, the churches of Macedonia. All right, so what's the grace of God? What has God given to these people that's shown favor? Well, in verse 2 it says that in a great trial of affliction, that doesn't sound like favor being shown, but no, life has these moments where we are afflicted and where there are great trials. That's in of itself not the grace. It's how we handle that in grace that God teaches us a different way or a different path. Well, what would you normally do when you were in a trial of great affliction? Well, normally you would be taking the scraps of whatever it was that you had, and you would be trying to get yourself out of that situation. You'd be trying to help yourselves. God only helps those who help themselves, is what the saying is, even though it's not found in the Bible. But look as it goes on here to describe what they did. Instead of trying to help themselves, it says the abundance of their joy, which is again, in spite of their affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality, their giving, their generosity. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing to give, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift of the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. They wanted to give because they wanted to serve others and participate in the serving of others. And not only as we had hoped, but they also gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. Well, you could ask the question, Macedonians, what about you? What about you? And we don't have the answer to that question. We don't know how their trial ended. We don't know how they got what they needed. But they were clearly fulfilled in what they were doing because they had chosen to be fulfilled in unfulfillment. There will always be a better opportunity to give than now in our minds. It's always when we have more for ourselves. It's always when things are a little bit more stable for us financially, when we have that emergency fund built up or whatever it is, whatever metric we want to use. There's always a better time to give than now. But if you want to understand being fulfilled and unfulfillment, understand what the Macedonians did and how they first gave themselves to the Lord. And when you first given yourself to the Lord, you realize that no matter what situation you're in, God is going to give you exactly what you need for that moment. And maybe if you have a little extra, maybe it's not good for you to hold on to that. I remember as a missionary going around and asking for churches to help what we were trying to do overseas. I remember a woman coming up to us, and she had, I think it was $17 in her hand, and she took that $17 and she handed it over to us, and she said that God had given her $17 extra this paycheck. What does that tell you about the way this woman lived? She was living from paycheck to paycheck. This paycheck, she had $17 extra, and she said, "Here, I want you to have this, and I want you to use it for what you were trying to do." Super humbling to be on the receiving end of something like that. But I saw in her the grace of God bestowed upon the Macedonians. She understood something, and I hope one day that I can understand it better. We need to be fulfilled in unfulfillment, and I hope that this spirals off into many points of reflection for you. Number two, as we return to the thoughts of Hebrews chapter 11, we also need to be mindful about forgetting. To be mindful about forgetting. In chapter 11 and verse 15, it says this about those patriarchs. "And truly, if they had called to mind the country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return." If they had really thought about where they had come from and compared where they had come from with where they were, they would have been maybe persuaded to go back to where they were. As we talked about, Ur of the Chaldees was a whole lot nicer than the tents of Canaan, right? He had a whole lot nicer place that he lived when God called him than where he lived for the rest of his life. To go back to that marshmallow experiment that Stanford University conducted, one of the marshmallow experiments, there's actually a few different ones. One of them was a little bit complicated, and so I hope that you'll bear with me to explain it the best way that I can, and I might butcher it, and I apologize ahead of time if I do. But all the groups, the kids were divided up into 5 groups of kids, right? And so A, B, C, D, E are the 5 groups of kids. All the groups were told that the adult conducting the experiment would leave and then come back in 15 minutes, and then they would play with toys together. So that's what they were told. The adult will leave and then come back in 15 minutes, and you'll play toys together. And but after the adult left, they were also told that you can ring a bell, and the adult will come back immediately. right? Right when you ring that bell. So you don't have to wait 15 minutes. You can wait 15 minutes, all right? And so 5 groups of kids, and they were all given that particular instruction. But in the first of those 3 groups, A, B, and C, they were given 2 treats, a marshmallow and a pretzel, and they were told that when the adult comes back in 15 minutes, if you'll wait the 15 minutes, you'll get the one that you like more. They were told, which one of these do you like more, marshmallow or pretzel? So you'll get the one that you like more, or if you ring the bell, the adult will come back and you'll get the one that you don't like as much, right? So that was the kind of the deal. Now, in that group, there's a little bit more to it than that. We'll talk about that in just a second. So the other 2 groups, D and E, they were told nothing about any treats. So there was no idea about treats in what they were told at all. Now, like I said, it's a little bit complicated. All right, so A and D, groups A and D, all right? A and D were given a toy to play with while the adult was gone, a slinky, right? And then B and E were told to think about fun things. Think about songs, think about things that are fun, think about, and we're kind of guided in some fun things, that they could think about during that time. And group C was given absolutely no distraction at all, right? And I think you can see there the effect of that, right? Already there's a little bit of a pause point, here for this experiment. As we think about the idea of a prospect of future blessing, delayed gratification, when you are not given any distraction, whether in thing to do or thing to think about, you have less ability to endure than those who have no future, blessing or thing that they're looking towards, right? But I want to keep thinking about this and realize this about, this experiment. Those looking for a reward without any distraction proved to be the least patient. Those whose minds were occupied were the most patient. What does that tell you about mindset, where we need to be in our own thoughts? As we think about, again, this statement about Hebrews 11, verse 15, it wasn't merely that these people had something to do, it was that they were consciously thinking about certain things and consciously not thinking about other things. The best way to avoid thinking about one thing is to think about an entirely different thing, and I think they understood that. They weren't calling to mind the country from which they had come out. They were thinking about where it was that they were going, or more importantly, who it was that they were pursuing in God. Do I call to mind what I came out of? Or in case of some of us, where I've never been. Sometimes that can be the most deceiving trick of Satan. We've grown up in a Christian home in a sheltered environment to think that, I'm missing something out there outside of all of these things. Now, in saying that, you're like, well, Patrick, aren't you supposed to think about your past? Aren't you supposed to learn the lessons of your past? Aren't you supposed to realize, how far you've been brought by the Lord? We sing this song, and I actually really like this song. Remind me, dear Lord. I like the chorus of it. Roll back the curtain of memory now and then. Show me where you brought me from and where I could have been. Now, that's a very healthy way of looking at the past. That's not what Hebrews 11 and verse 15 is talking about. It's when we look at the past and we fail to see what these people saw, that is, that they desired a heavenly country. Whenever the past wins in our minds over what we are looking for in the present, that's where we are going to be tempted to return. The past must never win, and the thing even that we've never experienced or never done or never had must not win either. If I call to mind where I've been or where I even haven't been, with Satan's evaluation tools instead of God's, I've already taken a step towards the broad path. That by itself has put me in a direction that's going to lead me away from God. I want you to think about what the Psalms teach us about thinking about the past. And that is that the just and right don't view themselves as unique or exempt from failure, but they recognize the reality of the past repeating itself. In Psalm 106 and verse 3, first of all, I want you to open to Psalm 106 with me for a moment. Psalm 106 and verse 3. Psalms, among other things, teach us to be students of history, but students of history who are aware of history's tendency to repeat itself. In Psalm 106 and verse 3, blessed are those who keep justice and he who does righteousness at all times. And so people are blessed if they are just and if they are right. But the question is, how do you get that way? And though praise has something to do with it, as the verses that follow say, there's also this reality in verse number 6. He says, we have sinned with our fathers. We have committed iniquity. We have done wickedly. Now, why is he joining himself to the past? Because even though he might not have gone as far as the fathers, even though he might not have done what they did, he has sinned and he knows the reality of that. And he sees through them where sin takes them. And there's two powerful lessons that come out in this psalm as the psalmist is sort of reflecting upon the past. One is the powerful lesson that when we face hardship, if we don't realize what we have been brought from and who we are pursuing, then that hardship will cause us to forget what is true. Our fathers, in verse number 7, he begins as he thinks about history. Our fathers in Egypt did not understand your wonders. Now, what do you mean they didn't understand their wonders? They had already seen the 10 plagues, and they had seen how God had brought them out victoriously and triumphantly from Egypt. Yeah, they had seen all of that. They did see the wonders, but they didn't remember, as it says in the next thought. They didn't remember the multitude of your mercies, but rebelled by the sea, the Red Sea. How did they rebel? They rebelled because they were fearful about what they were facing, and they were thinking that the God who had brought them through all of those things somehow couldn't deal with a bit of water. And that's what happens all the time to us. Again, when a future or a current challenge is treated with the idea that God is on audition here rather than that God has demonstrated himself time and time again, and we don't remember, well, again, if we're not mindful about forgetting, and mindful about also therefore remembering, we will be turned away from him. And he goes on to describe what happened at the Red Sea. But then in verse 13, another lesson, it says, they soon forgot his works. They did not wait for his counsel, but lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tested God in the desert. And remember what they said when they were testing God? It was always about food, and always in their minds, they were talking about how good the food was in Egypt. And that's super funny. Like when I read those texts, it's like, I don't know, your translation may render the words differently, but it's like melon and leeks. And I'm like, I guess the nice melon might be good. Leeks, like Chantel makes some soups that have leeks in them. That's kind of nice and that kind of thing. But I mean, like that's not it's not like the pinnacle of fine cuisine when I think about, like a really, really good meal or something like that. And that's always the way that it is. But again, in the moment where we are facing having little or less, and we perceive that leaving God would give us more, that's always the way that it looks. Whatever it is that we had or whatever it is that others have, they always seem to be more and better and good and great. But again, all of that isn't true. We have to be mindful about forgetting, not being mindful of what it is that we have had or what it is that we even haven't had, but rather be mindful of how what God is giving us is better. And number 3, we need to be foreigners at home. Home is where you are not foreign. It is what is not foreign to you. And yet there's a certain way that these patriarchs were continually foreigners whenever they were even at home. These, it says in Hebrews 11 verse 13, confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. 2 confessions that are recorded of the patriarchs there. They said that they were strangers and that they were pilgrims. These are actually 2 different words, and they present 2 different pictures. The idea of a stranger is literally the idea of a foreigner, but the idea of a pilgrim is the idea of a resident alien. And typically the 2 things, even though they are synonyms, typically the 2 things wouldn't necessarily be used to describe the same kind of people. When I think about a resident alien, I think about the kind of person who lives in a place and embraces it and says, This is a place that I want to live. This is a place that I want to, I want my children to grow up in. It's a place that even though it wasn't where I was born, it's where I now am, and it's home. Resident alien is a person in our country who has been naturalized as a citizen, or maybe even someone who's holding a green card. But then there also is the person who comes and goes to a place where he's not at home, and rather than try to embrace the new thing that he is in, or that she is in, tries to recreate the experience of where he or she was, and never really embraces where he or she is. Now, where do you think this is? Put up this screen. This is Chinatown in San Francisco. And so when you think about the word that would describe this situation, it would be the word, really, foreigner. One of the things, of course, about the United States is that as more and more people come from more and more cultures, this scene is looking less and less foreign. And I'm not evaluating that one way or the other. I actually really enjoy Chinese food, and I like going to Chinatown for that reason. There's a lot of interesting and cool things there. But at the same time, two different philosophies about what you do when you come to a place that isn't your original home. And the Hebrews author says that both of these philosophies were at work in these forefathers of ours, the people of faith. That even though they found themselves really as resident aliens in a place, they were always strangers. Always strangers. They were never at home. God's people remain foreign in their own land, even if they were born there. You were born and raised in Fairbanks, you should still be a foreigner, simply because this world is not your home. The question that we have to ask as relates to this point is, do we embrace being foreign or do we deny it? Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, and this will be the last passage we have you look at this morning. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 69. Jesus is on trial, and Peter and John are interested enough, even though they fled when things didn't go, especially as Peter thought they would go in the garden, even though they fled away at that time, they've kind of followed and gotten themselves through maybe John's influence into the courtyard outside of where Jesus is going to be tried. And while John is more closely observing the events, Peter chooses to kind of take a position kind of on the outskirts of everything. And we pick up his story in Matthew 26 and verse 69. Peter sat outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him saying, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." There's something to realize about being in the world, that if you are a person who is really with Jesus, that will come out in some way. People will identify you somehow. Maybe they have seen who you are normally with. Maybe that's what's happening here. Or maybe it's the way that you talk. Maybe it's something that betrays you. In fact, as he says later, surely in verse 43, surely you are one of them. Your speech betrays you. Something's going to give you away. And in that moment, you will be tempted to try to blend in. You'll be tempted to try to just be like one of them. You'll be tempted to just fly under the radar, to not bother anybody, to not make a scene or cause any disturbance. And sometimes there might be real things at stake for revealing who you are, such as Peter is in the courtyard and his master is getting tried with the very real prospect of death as an outcome. You also were with Jesus of Galilee, but he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you are saying." And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth." You can guarantee that when that test gets, given and failed once, that it's going to repeat itself. And that Satan is going to double down on the temptation for you to continue to hide who you are and to continue to put your faith into the closet and close the door so that no one can see it. And again, he says he denied it with an oath, saying, "I do not know the man." He doubled down himself and added an oath to his denial. A little later, those who stood by came and said, up and said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them. Your speech betrays you. We can tell by what you're saying that you were with Jesus." And then he says, "Well, I'll show you." He began to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know the man." And how did he get there? He got there through that first interaction by not owning who he was and deciding that he was going to be foreign no matter what. It says, immediately a rooster crowed. Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So he went out and wept bitterly. I could tell you that the moment that you will regret, if you manage to come back from all of that, the moments that you will regret the most in life are these kinds of moments. The moments where you could have made a difference for your faith, where you could have made a decision for Jesus, and you didn't. Those of us who've been in the church long enough have a lot of those moments that we remember. Like I said, they will haunt you. They will cause you to weep bitterly. So much better to embrace what God has given you. God is not ashamed to be called the God of a certain kind of people. There's a lot of people, as we've been studying in Wednesday nights, there's a lot of people who own God, and through their owning of God actually bring shame to his name. We're talking about that in Ezekiel 36. But God is not ashamed for others to own him as God because of these attitudes and these attributes. They're being fulfilled in unfulfillment, they're being mindful about forgetting, and they're being foreigners at home. And those are all the things that define the patriarchs. And they were all the things that led God to own them and that led God to reward them. Where is our desire this morning? Where does our desire rest? What are we really trying to be and to become? I hope that these things define you. I hope that they define me. If you're struggling with any of these things, if there's any way that we can help you this morning, let us know while we stand and sing this song.